Caitlin here with TransZen Explorer. So a while back I had made a video on glutamate excitotoxicity. What? I would like to redo the video because my knowledge has built since then, and I also just wanted to make a higher quality video for you guys. So what is glutamate excitotoxicity? Anybody know? So, glutamate is one of the most abundant neurotransmitters in the body and nervous system. It's super fundamental for a variety of things such as learning, memory, neuroplasticity, spatial recognition, and ultimately neural activation. And so glutamate will bind to a glutamate receptor, and there are a few different receptor subtypes. And glutamate binding to the receptor ultimately causes opening of a calcium channel, which lets calcium rush into the brain cell or nerve cell or neuron, whatever you like to call it, and will change the chemical gradient, specifically the ionic gradient of the cell, causing an electrical impulse to be created and propagated down the cell through the axon, where it ends up reaching the end of the cell and causing the release of neurotransmitters which carry the signal to the next cell. So glutamate is a pretty fundamental part of activating the nervous system. You know, those electrical impulses or action potentials, they're fundamental for making sure our heart is beating, our muscles are moving, our digestion is working, and pretty much every intelligent neural pathway in the body relies on glutamate. So, what is excitotoxicity? So, as I mentioned, glutamate is an excitatory neurotransmitter. It excites the nervous system and allows signals to be conducted and spread throughout the system. But sometimes you can have too much glutamate binding. And this is something that we actually are starting to see a lot in autoimmune conditions, neurodegenerative conditions, psychiatric conditions, and metabolic conditions. And so they all have this key elements to them, which is glutamate excitotoxicity. So what happens is when you have an inflamed or imbalanced system, whether you have a chronic infection or you have chronic stress or you have exposure to toxins, or perhaps you are eating foods that are inflaming the nervous system and creating immune dysfunction. Anytime you have elevated inflammation and increased and dysregulated cytokine activity, cytokines are pro-inflammatory molecules, by the way, you tend to see this hypersensitization of the glutamate receptors. So what ends up happening is the glutamate is binding, and these receptors are basically becoming overexcited and oversensitive. So, you know, your glutamate's binding, and then the neuron is firing. Well, that's cool, except when you're firing, you start to kind of short circuit the system. Here is my impersonation of a neuron short circuiting. Yeah, now you guys know what it's really like. So when we see this overexcitation of the neuron happening, it's basically like burning out and like shorting a fuse. And each time that glutamate is binding, it's releasing all these radical oxygen species or free radicals, which cause oxidative stress and damage cell structures, particularly the cell walls of neurons, which are like primarily fat and fatty lipid membranes. Lipids are the most susceptible to being oxidized, and so you get all these free radical oxygen species being released by this constant over excessive excitation, and you start getting oxidative stress and damage to neural structures such as the cell wall or dendrites or synaptic spines, and you actually start seeing like this shriveling of neural structures from the damage that's occurring. And so you'll have your neurons, and when they're getting overstimulated by the glutamate, they start to like get damaged and shrivel, and next thing you know, you have less synaptic connections happening because a lot of the synapses that were forming like a web to communicate are being damaged and dying, and this can actually lead to the entire cell dying, or what we would call apoptosis, programmed cell death. So we see that this on a macro scale will actually cause shrinking and deterioration and atrophy of brain regions. For example, in people with depression and other things such as Alzheimer's and neurodegenerative diseases, we see shriveling of areas in the brain such as the hippocampus and the amygdala, which are fundamental for memory, pulling memories out, reforming memories, acknowledging memories. And so it's not good when you have glutamate basically frying your brain out. So now that I've scared you guys that this is something that could happen, what causes glutamate excitotoxicity? Well, as I mentioned, it's likely a multifaceted thing, but the underlying sort of thing accompanying it that I see is chronic inflammation and immune system dysregulation. So there are some foods that can contribute to excitotoxicity. We see things like monosodium glutamate, which is MSG, is basically a type of glutamate salt and can induce excitotoxicity. We also see certain nutritional deficiencies can promote excitotoxicity, specifically for things like folate or vitamin B12 or vitamin B6. Those are all play an important role in balancing neural structure, balancing neurons and neurotransmitters, making sure everything is cool. And we also see things like chronic stress contributing to it, and trauma. It seems like any sort of like childhood trauma or PTSD, there's this comorbidity of glutamate excitotoxicity happening. There's also some foods that are quite inflammatory, specifically dairy and wheat. They have proteins in them called gluten and casein, and they're opioid proteins, and both of these proteins have been found to inhibit uptake of the amino acid cysteine in the gut. Now, how is this related to glutamate? So there's this wonderful molecule called glutathione, which is the most powerful and abundant antioxidant that our body creates. So an antioxidant's job is to neutralize free radicals that cause oxidation. And that is precisely what the glutamate excitotoxicity induces, is this oxidative stress. So glutathione is composed of glutamate, cysteine, and glycine amino acids formed together. So what happens when you don't have enough cysteine, because maybe you're eating lots of bread and cheese or other malabsorptions happening or whatnot? Cysteine is basically the rate limiting factor in deciding how much glutathione gets produced. So if you are not getting enough cysteine and you just have glycine and glutamate hanging around waiting for cysteine to come along to make glutathione, then all of a sudden you're going to have an abundance of glutamate that's just not being utilized, and you're going to have a reduction in glutathione, which is the antioxidant that you truly need to combat the overexcitation that we have from this extra glutamate hanging out in the system. So that's just one way that foods can contribute to glutamate excitotoxicity, or any sort of gut dysbiosis where the nervous system and the enteric system in the gut are kind of screwy and inflamed. So that's kind of what causes glutamate excitotoxicity. Now, what can we actually do about it? Well, luckily, there are a number of things that have been found to combat glutamate excitotoxicity, and just some herbs and supplements and nutrients. As I described before, the methylated form of B vitamins are really important to make sure you're resourced with so that your pathways don't get all screwy and end up pushed on this glutamate end of things. There's also a number of herbs, so things like ashwagandha have been found to reduce glutamate excitotoxicity, blueberry extract, L-theanine reduces glutamate excitotoxicity. L-theanine is an amino acid found in green tea that's very good at calming people down. Ketamine, which is a drug that is used recreationally but also clinically, especially for its effect on depression these days. It has been shown to reduce excitotoxicity and damage induced by excitotoxicity. So there's a number of things that you can use as far as chemical agents. Also, psychedelics and serotonergic molecules seem to reduce excitotoxicity by actually modulating the serotonin system. So serotonin seems to play a role in regulating glutamate activity, so perhaps actually targeting defects or deficiencies in other neurotransmitters that could potentially affect the downstream tendency for glutamate to kind of get rampant and out of control. Mindfulness practice is also an incredible way to just get the nervous system to stop being like that washing machine that's like ka-tunk, ka-tunk, ka-tunk. We all know what that feels like, right? So mindfulness practice or any sort of nervous system retraining where you're ultimately teaching the nervous system how to get out of this excitotoxic stress response and flipped into that parasympathetic response. So another thing that you can do to combat glutamate excitotoxicity is to basically mitigate the damage. So we have oxidation and inflammation and even degeneration of these neural structures. And one way that we can combat that is by boosting our ability to grow and repair these structures. So there is a molecule called BDNF, and it stands for brain-derived neurotrophic factor. And it is basically a neural growth factor that prompts the growing and repairing of new neurons, dendrites, and synaptic spines. So when we see neurons that are kind of shriveled or damaged because of neuroinflammation or excitotoxicity, we can basically upregulate these neural structures, and it's like spraying fertilizer on your garden, and you'll be able to prompt the growth of these new structures and repair connections between neurons that have ultimately been dissolved or damaged. And this is relevant to depression, anxiety, and other psychiatric conditions because largely conventional medicine has, been treating depression and all these conditions by using SSRIs and thinking that it's all about serotonin or neurotransmitters. They're somehow have a deficiency and they don't have enough neurotransmitters. Well, what we're finding is that's actually not usually the case. People do seem to have enough neurotransmitter. They're just not being allocated or released in proper ways. And glutamate excitotoxicity really comes into the picture because if you have two neurons that are doing pretty healthy, they have all these dendrites and synaptic spines, and they're able to make all these neural connections and create a really strong neural network that is part of a healthy nervous system and a healthy cognition. Now say you start getting kind of fried out, short-circuiting this guy, and some of your dendrites start to die and shrivel. Well, now you have less synaptic connections happening, and it might mimic the feeling of not having enough neurotransmitter, but really there might just not be enough opportunities for the neurotransmitter to be sent to that receiving neuron. So that's something we're starting to discover in the literature, and as we get better at looking at mood disorders and mental illnesses, that perhaps it's not so much about whether the neurotransmitters are deficient or not, it's about the level of healthy synaptic connections that allow proper cell-to-cell communication to occur, and really neuroinflammation is kind of the driving factor and piece of all of this. So I hope that this helps you understand a little bit more about what excitotoxicity is. It's still one of those subjects that most of the medical community and even the neuroscience community hasn't really figured out is a thing, but rest assured there is a lot of scientific literature on it, and some of the most cutting edge researchers and medical professionals are aware of it. And so just keep it on your radar as something that might be going on if you struggle yourself with feeling nervous system imbalances or mood disorders, or if you are a medical practitioner, just keep this in mind that it's likely a big part of whatever sort of autoimmune condition or cognitive condition your loved one or client is going through. Thank you so much for tuning in to this episode of TransZen Explorer, and we're out.